Welcome to Sensing the Signal. I'm Terry Patar from Atreides. We're exploring the overlap between data, technology and intelligence in our increasingly volatile and complex world, what this means for national security, and how deeper insight can help organisations make better decisions. I've spent the past 20 years helping organisations improve their intelligence capabilities. I'm fascinated by how we understand the world around us. Now I get to talk to some of the leading voices who I've learned from myself. This time I'm joined by Anna Gilmour, Head of Country Risk and Geopolitics at Verisk Maplecroft. Anna and I worked together some time ago, but we're talking today about geopolitics, risk and lots of other connected issues. So Anna, thanks for joining us on the podcast. It's great to welcome you onto this episode of Sensing the Signal. I really wanted to talk to you about a topic that I think gets a lot of attention in certain areas, but not in others. And it's really what you do, which is political risk analysis and geopolitical risk analysis, I suppose, more broadly. It would be great to get an understanding from you of how you do all of that, and what do you think about when you think about political risk, and what is it from your perspective, and maybe in the work that you do currently with Verisk.
Great. Thanks very much, Terry. Great to be here, and certainly plenty to talk about in the topic you just outlined. So yes, I started out as a political risk analyst more than 20 years ago now. So I've been working in the kind of political risk domain for all that time. A lot has happened, many things to cover, but I think the core of what I do and what my team at Verisk Maplecroft does is we focus on identifying political risk. What are the components of political risk? What is driving political risk? How is it changing? And crucially, what does that mean? We work a lot with businesses, corporates and financials. So we're always looking for that so what factor. Why is political risk relevant for you as a company? Why should you be looking at it? And also, how can you be looking at it? A lot of people come to us and say, political risk is government change and political instability. How can we affect that? We can't affect that, so we just need to react to it. Whereas a lot of what we do is talking about, well, actually, yes, you can't affect it, but you can mitigate it and you can manage it in that sense. And if you are planning it, and if you're scenario planning or war gaming different outcomes of political risk, you can definitely build that into your business planning and have an idea of the different pathways that you might need to follow. Yeah,
that's really interesting. And I suppose for any organisation, whether it's a business, a government, or anyone that's planning for the future, you can't mitigate risks if you don't understand them and if you're not aware that they're there. So I suppose there's got to be that element of trying, at least, whatever the system they use or however they do it, to think about what could affect their operations and what could affect them, their future strategic planning even, and tracking that and monitoring it. It'd be great to get an insight from you of how you do it in a bit more detail in terms of what does it look like? What does it mean for the organisations that you're advising or helping understand? Because it's an important part of understanding the world around us, I suppose, in terms of, they're going to be busy doing what they do, which is creating what they create, selling their products, whatever it might be. Or, for other organisations, delivering projects, or it could be anything. But their focus isn't always going to be on, right, what could come along and really disrupt what we're doing? And or what are just the things that could slightly shift one way or another that might change the operating environment or the way that we work, etc. So how do you go about doing it? How do you understand the world around us, I suppose, through a sort of political risk lens?
Really good question, because I think I've spent the last 20 years trying to work out how do we measure political risk. Tell me when we have a final answer. But what we've been doing at Verisk Maplecroft is we combine a kind of quantitative approach and a qualitative approach. So on the quantitative side, we have 198 different risk indices, as we call them. We use, it's a very large number of indices. I appreciate we aim to cover what we call 360-degree risk. And these will cover issues such as government instability, civil unrest, government change, all the way through to issues such as climate change, drought hazard, water stress, and human rights issues as well. So what we aim there is to give the client the opportunity to select what type of risk they feel is most relevant for their business operations, and we'll offer guidance on that as well. So we have that framework of risk, and that's updated, either quarterly or perhaps for the less dynamic ones on an annual basis. But most importantly, it covers, as I said, multiple countries. We cover 198 different countries. So we have the different indices, are going up to more than 200 in some cases.
Right. So I was going to say, so is that 198 indices? So 198, say, data points you're tracking for 198 countries.
So it's 198 countries, and then we have, for example, we have 65 political risk data points, risk indices, but then we also have the different risk indices for climate change and environment, also for human rights. We have climate change data which looks at different climate scenarios. So we have kind of a varying number of indices. So by some counts, we're going up to 300, but I'd say it's probably more around 160 when you count the multiple ones when you look at climate pathways. So we have those data points there. But we also have a large team of analysts as well. So within my team, which is the country risk and geopolitics team, we have analysts who are experts on their countries. We have regional teams. And we also have a human rights team who are very expert in human rights and social issues, and also the climate change and environment team as well. So we work very closely together. So we tend to use our risk indices as that framework for looking at where risks are and, importantly, where they're emerging, and combine that with our qualitative analysis to provide the insights for the client. So to give an example, our political risk index goes back to 2017. So we've been tracking how that has performed each quarter. We're currently at highest levels since we introduced that index and that methodology back in 2017. So a lot of the work that we've been doing this year, and as we've been tracking that index, is looking at why is political risk so high? What's driving that? What are the subcomponents of political risk? And then when we're talking to clients, importantly, what does this matter for your business? And is there anything you can do about it? The answer is usually yes, there is a mitigation you can put in place. So what are you going to do to address those issues of political risk? So that's where we as a company move from monitoring and identifying political risk into supporting with mitigation and planning.
Wow. Okay. That's there's a few points I want to pick up on there that you mentioned. The first one being, this is the highest level of political risk you've seen since 2017. And that's really interesting because, we're talking here in London at the end of, as we get closer to the end of 2024, which has been a really significant year in many ways for the work that you do, just from the sheer number of elections we've seen around the world. So in terms of political change and shifts in individual countries, we've seen just over half, I think, of the world's countries going through some sort of elections. And how do you see that kind of playing into perhaps the trends that you're seeing, or vice versa? How do those trends play out in different parts of the world? Is there something combined or coming together across the different countries you're tracking, or is it that the risk is increasing in different places because of very localized reasons?
I think the short answer is a combination of both your points, but looking at it in a bit more detail, what we're seeing driving that rise in political risk has been, of course, the pandemic is perhaps the obvious one to point back to. And I think we're still seeing the tail of that. We're still feeling the inflationary impacts. We're feeling that economic impact on countries. And that's very much fed into this super election cycle. A lot of the governments that have lost power this year are governments that were either in office at the time of the pandemic or are closely associated with pandemic response. So I think a lot of this year has been about working out that electoral process and response to the pandemic. So we went into this year very much thinking this is going to be a year of upheaval. We knew that there were going to be a lot of elections, in major countries across the world. So I think elections are always fought on those local issues, but there are global themes feeding those local issues. So that's where I see the combination between your point there around the pandemic. We're also seeing the major conflicts that are still ongoing, Ukraine, Russia, and of course in the Middle East. So a lot of that has impact beyond the borders of that conflict. Even when, as a voter, you may not necessarily know that the increase in your weekly shop is driven by a conflict half the world away, you're still feeling that impact. And as a government, that's something that you will be looking at when you do the planning. And as a business as well, that's part of what you look at in terms of your costs to the business and also your operational risks where you're operating as well. So I think that's where we look at political risks, is in terms of, yes, it's really interesting to track, for me as a political risk analyst, to track the rise in political risk and to see what's driving it. But what does it mean for countries and also then for companies that operate in those countries? How is that playing out for them? And that's where I think we get to the second point in your question about, is it playing out differently locally? And I think very much so. You see different trends in different countries. We'll always see that, but particularly in terms of political risk, I'd say, for example, in Africa, you're seeing it combined with a lot of issues around government instability and increasing conflict, which I think in some cases you can also link to climate change and enforced migration from particular areas. So what I'm trying to say is you can't really look at political risk in isolation. Political risk is rising because of a combination of factors. And we try and look at the interconnectedness of risk. That's kind of a phrase that we use to bring in all of those 160 different risk indices and say, political risk is government change, it is civil unrest, it is protests on the streets, but it's also being driven by the broader factors around that. So, for example, are you having an election in a country which has been directly impacted by conflict or a country which is indirectly impacted? And how is that different impact felt and how is it expressed electorally?
Yeah, that's really fascinating. A couple of things I want to sort of delve into a bit further. One is that combination you described of the data, the quantitative analysis and the qualitative. How much is the analysis on the qualitative side, the expert analysts you've got in your team, how much is their work driven or shaped by what they see in the data? Or is it helped in terms of what they focus on, or how does that complementary sort of combination work, I suppose?
Really interesting question, because my first response was going to be we're very much driven by the data. But then I think sometimes we have an idea of what's going on in our countries and we go and look at the data. Mm-hmm. So it's more of a circular relationship than it might seem. But we have that data set, and what we always tend to do is we look at the trends within it. We have some predictive data sets which predict a year in advance, but we also look at what's been happening over the previous 5 years, as I mentioned, with the political risk index. And what we do there is see if something is moving in a particular direction, and if it's a key trend that we're seeing, we should definitely be writing about it and doing additional research and putting together a piece of qualitative analysis that uses the data. So I'd say that we don't produce any qualitative analysis that doesn't include the data, because I think it's a really important input. But the other important insight is the analyst knowledge, both of the region and the theme. So you're able to write about the data and pull out that so what there that our clients are really looking for.
And this is where I'm going to come in with maybe a bit more of I hesitate to say this, but a slightly geeky question around how is the data created? When we're talking about these indices, how does the data sort of become data for you guys? And because I know it's always difficult when you're trying to put maybe a quantitative measure on some of the things that you're trying to track, but so how does that work in practice?
I'm going to put my hands up here and say I'm not a data analyst.
Sure.
So this is not going to be a very technical answer, I'm afraid. But we do have an expert analytics team which sits separately to our kind of country risk or human rights teams. So they create and maintain the indices. So what they're looking at there is we pull on different sources externally. So we will use some third-party data. We'll also use, for example, natural language processing feeds into some of our data sets as well. So we're always trying to look at different ways that we can use technology to bring more data in. We also have a relatively small proportion of indices that are scored by analysts, so scored by my team. So, for example, corruption, we use analyst knowledge of their country to score that. Right. And it isn't just an analyst wakes up in the morning and thinks, well, I think corruption in this country has increased, so I'm going to put the score up. We have a much more rigorous methodology than that. But it's the case that we have a set framework. So we as analysts, when we're scoring those analyst-led indices, are asked specific questions around, how many incidences of grand corruption have there been this year? How many court cases have there been? So it's very much research-led, and it's still a structured parameter for analysis. So that's how we put together the different types of indices. We have the large majority coming from the models and our analytics team, the smaller proportion from the analyst-led approach. But all of it together is put on a 0 to 10 scale so that you can compare across countries and across risk issues as well.
That's a really fascinating insight for me, and I hope for everyone listening, because I know we hear about phrases like political risk, and we might then hear descriptions like, okay, we've got all these indices and we're tracking all this data, but understanding how that actually works is quite important, I think, because it plays into the so what, and it plays into understanding the importance of a particular measure and understanding it for an organisation and what it means for them. So I think that's really, really interesting. But maybe zooming out a little bit and thinking about the broader picture, you mentioned conflict. We've seen several conflicts that have really grabbed everyone's attention in the last couple of years. I know certainly from the work I've done, there's been a focus on the conflict in Sudan, conflict in Ukraine, what's happening in Gaza. And there seems to be a lot more conflict taking place. I think you're seeing that in the data and the trends that you've got as well. What does that tell us maybe about some of the things, some of those risks that could be cutting across lots of different sectors, etc.? Do you see those conflicts worsening, I suppose? Do you see any, and do you actually spend, or are you able to spend time looking into them and saying, okay, well, how do these play out, and what kind of scenarios might we see evolving in each of those conflicts, and how do they link together? Because you talked about the sort of interconnectedness of things, and especially when we are talking about these kind of events that have a global impact, it's a complex issue. It's a complex thing to try and tackle, and to say, okay, what is the impact of this conflict, and how will it be shaped, and how will it change? But how much of your work is sort of, I guess, focused on that?
So obviously we look at it from a regional perspective, then moving up to global. So, for example, our MENA team is looking at the Israel and broader Middle East issues at the moment. Ukraine issues we look at within our Europe team, but we're always talking across the team to talk about what is our view on it, how will it go forward. So, for example, our Ukraine analyst is talking to our US analyst about what policy might be following January 20th next year, and equally, what will be the implications there. So, for example, if you're looking at the Middle East, when it all happened towards the end of last year and moving into this year, we were doing a lot of scenario work around, do we think that the conflict will escalate in the Middle East? Will it be, involve other regional actors? We were also looking at perhaps, the more operational issues of, if you are a company whose supply chain stretches through the Red Sea and there are a lot more attacks there, what can you do about it? How is that going to impact your business? So I think there's the two strands that we're looking at. We're looking at that kind of tactical operational approach, and then we're looking at the long-term strategic approach. And you mentioned scenario planning, and that's something that we focus on a lot at Maplecroft. And I think the strategic angle is where the scenario planning comes in, because I think scenario planning is an excellent example of where you can combine quantitative input and that qualitative input as well to produce that so what output for a client. So there you would be looking at, if you have a client coming in and saying, my supply chain stretches through the Red Sea, these ships are coming under attack, my costs are going up, I'm not getting my goods to the shops, what can I do about it? Is this going to be a short-term issue? Is it going to be a long-term issue? That's where scenario planning comes in really helpful, because you can never say with 100% certainty what's going to happen. And if you can, I would really like to know how, because it's not something I've cracked yet. Yeah. But you put together a few scenarios. We usually like to go for 3. I find that 3 is kind of the good outcome, because it gives you the most likely, the plausible alternative, and then an outlier scenario. And that really helps with business planning, because you get that sense of, what do we think is most likely, and we can make the plans about it. But then equally, what is the plausible alternative, and should we be planning for that as well? So having those together is a really useful tool for companies in terms of what should we be doing both immediately, but also what should we be thinking about long term in terms of political risk.
Yeah, that sounds really critical, I suppose, for a lot of organisations in terms of what you talked about earlier, which is using the data that you're producing and the qualitative analysis with it to help them understand how risks can play out, but also get them thinking about how to mitigate those risks. So when you're using scenario planning, for example, are you able to say, okay, in this particular scenario, we're likely to see the data or our analysis shifting in this direction over time, and to give a sense maybe of what the tripwires might be as you're leading towards a particular scenario or a particular situation shifting in a direction that may prompt that organization, your client, for instance, to make a different decision or to change their plans? Is that something you're able to plot out from those scenarios? I know scenarios are always intended to, I think, generate more thinking around a situation. Like you said, they're not intended to be a precise forecast about, this is what's going to happen. It's different options, but are you able to use that and track back from those to sort of think about, okay, this is how we'd see the measurements in our data change, or an analyst would be looking out for certain types of shifts or changes in policies perhaps in a country? And is that what, I guess, organisations are looking for?
Definitely. I think a lot of the use of a scenario exercise is putting in place the tripwires, as you mentioned, and we call them signals, so very on brand for your podcast.
Excellent. Yeah, perfect.
So what we'll do when we're putting together a scenario planning exercise is we'll put together the 3 scenarios, and then we'll put together signals for the fact that we're going towards one of the 3 scenarios. And as you said, that might be a data point from our data. It might be exposure to regional conflict, which is one of our indices, has clicked into very high risk, moving up from a high risk category. So that would flag as an alert, and we say, okay, this is something you need to look at. Equally, it might be an external input. So it might be an election result that we think will lead towards one scenario outcome. Sometimes it could be a new piece of trade or trade policy or regulation. So we think very carefully about what goes in there. And that's where you get that measure, that balance between quant and qual inputs, because you can look at the data, but there also are events that will happen that are those signals on the way to a scenario.
And I suppose the scenarios enable you to map out the sort of the what if and the so what's around a situation, how it might change and what it might mean for a particular organisation. And in a way that if you were just saying, well, the data could go this way or it could go that way, doesn't quite take them to that point, but actually crafting scenarios, I suppose, helps have that discussion.
I think it's really useful to have the conversation with the client beforehand. That's a key part of it, to not only to find out why are they asking for this scenario, what do they want to get out of it, but also how are they going to use it for planning, because that shapes what we're looking at as well. So we can say, this event that we think is going to happen in the world, it will impact you in these ways, and then you can plan around it. It's also, going back to the foundations of doing the scenario analysis, it's really important to have a clear question, because I think sometimes you look at how will the world be in 3 years' time, which is fascinating. We spend a lot of time discussing it, but it's very hard to put together a scenario because there are so many moving parts. If you as a business have a really clear view of, I would like a scenario on will attacks in the Red Sea reduce by the end of this year, that is a really clear question that we can answer and do a lot of research around. Interestingly, sometimes we start talking to clients and they come to us with a question. You have the conversation, you think, well, actually, that's not the question that you want answered. It's the theme that you want. You want to know how the world will be in 3 years' time, but actually what you really want to know is, can I operate in this particular country in 3 years' time? The two are interconnected, but once you've really drilled it down into that particular scenario of, should I open a factory in Vietnam, for example? Good question with the trade trends at the moment. Should I open a factory in Vietnam? What are the inputs there that would be positive for that scenario or negative for that scenario? That's when you can start really looking at what the signals are. Because if you're looking at signals on a global trajectory, there's a lot of noise to cut through. But when you're looking at a really specific situation, that's when you can get very specific about the signals.
But you presumably then, when you are looking at a specific situation for a specific question, you do have to tie in the global trends, and you've got to broaden it out as well and understand what the impact is for that situation. How much have you seen maybe a shift in that balance between local circumstances being the predominant factors you would use to assess change in a situation versus the interaction of global trends? And it's a slightly leading question because I'm thinking in terms of climate change in particular. And, you and I have talked before, and we've talked about how much that's playing a much bigger role, perhaps, in assessing risk than it may have done maybe at the beginning of your career. And have you started to see that come through in the analysis you're producing?
Definitely. And my company was founded 20 years ago, and then we provided ESG, environmental, social and governance advice to mainly extractive companies. And political risk was implicit in that, but it wasn't specifically called out. Fast forward 10 years, we as a company were working for a lot more sectors by then, but equally we'd broadened out beyond ESG to look at all those different issues, and political risk was there, economics, trade. Here we are another 10 years on, and we've broadened out to that number of risk indices that I mentioned earlier. But I think what the key thing is it's about what we are thinking about, and I think that goes to in your question about, are we looking at these things now? So climate change, great example. I think we were as a company, we were looking at it early because we had that environment focus. But it's something that we've seen come up on the agenda a lot more from clients. So often we would be saying to clients, climate change is something you should be looking at. It's driving these risks. Now it's proactive. Regulation has moved so fast. There's a lot of regulation around environment, climate change, nature-related disclosures, that I think companies are having to look at this now. So there's an element of before it was being proactive, now it's being reactive to regulation. But I think there's still work to be done around the interconnections there, because you might have a climate and environment department, you might have a sustainability department, you might have a political risk department. They might all be separate departments, or they might be all joined up and talking. I'm probably biased because I look at all these risks together, but I think that you have to look at them together, because otherwise you might be missing some part of the puzzle that you really need to start planning. Even if you're looking at one particular area of regulation or business, you need to know what's going on in the other areas to impact it.
Yeah, that's really interesting to get that sense of how these things come together. And climate is obviously very topical for everyone because it's becoming a more and more urgent issue. We've recently had COP29 in Baku. There's obviously a lot of international attention and initiatives focused on trying to address climate change and tackle and mitigate some of those risks. But presumably from the work you're doing, you see it playing a bigger role going forward rather than a smaller role in terms of advising people on what are the things you need to think about that could go wrong or that could affect your operations in a particular place, or your decision to go here, or your supply chains, or whatever it might be. Is that going to become sort of a much bigger focus, do you think, in terms of the mixture of risks that you're looking at?
Definitely. I think climate change itself is such a huge and multifaceted issue that we could spend an entire podcast discussing that for sure.
Yeah, sadly,
but I think when you look at it in combination with other risks, that's where you can pick it apart and say, climate change as something that is happening and that needs to be managed both globally and by individual businesses is one thing, and that's addressed through regulation. But when you look at its kind of intersection with the other risks, which is perhaps more where I come in, that's where you look at what is the global trend towards managing and mitigating climate change. And I think you're seeing differences there. You're seeing clear differences in the kind of the pace of regulation between the EU and the US. And that also means that businesses are caught between different levels of activity against climate change, and what does that mean for them? So if you're a global business, usually you will be looking to maintain the same standards across your businesses. So whether you're based in, whether you're headquartered in one continent and you have your main operations in another, you will be looking to maintain the same standards of regulatory reporting. And I think that goes for your approaches to climate change as well. That's something that as a business, as a country, can't be done separately in different regions. It has to be done all together. And that's where I think you need to bring in what are the implications of it. So if you're operating, if you have physical assets or supply chain through an area which is going to be exposed to much more extreme weather patterns, what does that mean for you as a business? That translates into many different types of risk. It's the climate change risk itself is the banner for risks related to, will this affect your electricity supply? Will it affect your labour supply if people move away from that area for climate change reasons? Could it lead to conflict in the area if people are fighting over access to resources? What are all the issues that will play out there? And I think we talked a bit earlier about what is the time frame that you can look at risk over. Climate change is one where we have very good data and analysis on what will happen in specific climate pathways. So often that can be the foundational part of the analysis that you can then look at all the different types of risks that would come from one particular climate pathway versus another one.
And is that data holding up in terms of those climate pathways, or are you having to also change and adjust that as we get to understand more about how it's changing in the short term? Because I know obviously with climate you can look out over quite a long time frame to see what might happen and what is likely to happen, but in the short term, the actual effects of the impacts, the immediate impacts, I suppose, are difficult to predict, difficult to foresee. Or is that sort of something that you do have insight on? Are you able to sort of say, actually, over the next 12 months, we're likely to see more drought in a particular area, or something like that could drive other risks?
We do have concrete data on that, and I think that's one where you can have an element of prediction from that based on the data you've received in recent years. Again, I'm not going to stray into the role of my analytics team,
Sure.
But I think what you can look at is you can take what has been happening in a location, and a lot of our climate and environment data is geospatial. So you can look at it in a very small area. So you can look at what flood risk has there been in this area, what wildfire risk has there been in this area, what does this mean for the following year, or out through that climate pathway to 2050. So we do have concrete data on that, and it's really useful in terms of we can talk about what's happening, particularly in terms of businesses that are operating in countries where heat stress is rising sharply. And they often are many countries where there are a lot of industrial work. What does that mean in terms of, can you get the supply to electricity for your business? What do you need to put it? Do you need to put extra generators in place? So having that data is really foundational for business continuity planning.
Yeah, and I guess I'm in my head, I've got so many thoughts about climate change and the role it plays in the other things that we've talked about and the things you've just touched on in the past few minutes, just there about, for instance, talking about politics and regulation, and then thinking back to what we were discussing earlier about all the different elections we've seen and turnover of government. When we see change of government, we may see change of policy towards things like environmental regulations, and that can potentially have an interplay, I suppose, with climate change, or our options, I suppose, in terms of mitigating climate change or the effects of it. So I'm just thinking about how you and your team are working in that area where you've got to pull all of that together and sort of synthesize so much information from different places, different things going on in completely different areas, but that have a knock-on effect for each other. That's presumably part of the challenge, and I guess it's fascinating to think about how you do that. But maybe you give us an insight into how you prioritize where you're looking and what you look at when you think about, okay, this particular risk is going to shift because of several other connecting factors. Is that getting any easier to do, or is it getting harder? Because it feels like the world is more connected and there's more underlying risks like climate that will affect everybody and drive other sort of second and third order effects. How is that working for you? Or from your position of having done this for a while, having a lot of experience, is it getting harder, I suppose?
I think it ties in as well to the availability of information, because I think a lot of these risks were always there, but perhaps they weren't as high up the agenda, or information travelled more slowly. I remember when I started in the industry 20 years ago. I mean, we only recently had the internet, which makes me sound really, really old. But,
yeah, I suppose, the grand scheme of things, yes.
Yes, but you look back and you think you would see a rolling news update once or twice a day, whereas now you have news coming in all the time. You have those data points. So a lot of the work for us is cutting through that and what is the data that we can trust, and what is the relevant data. You said prioritizing risks. It's also about what is the data that we could and should be using, because we're lucky, I think, to have so much data, but we are one team, or individual analysts, and you have to process that data. So I think for us at Maplecroft, we're fortunate to have our internal data that our clients can use, because we've done a bit of cutting that out in a way. We have created a political risk monitoring tool. So, for example, the way I often go about it with a client is, first of all, you will talk to a client and you'd say, what are your risks that you're really focused on at the moment? What are the things that you want to be monitoring? And then we will do a stakeholder engagement and interview process where we talk not just to the initial team that we've discussed it with, but around the business as much as we can, and say, to individual teams, what are you concerned about? Or, teams in other locations, what are you concerned about? Very often we come back to the original stakeholder and say, well, you told us you were worried about these 5 risks, but actually we got several different risks coming up from other teams. So that really helps us to prioritise the risks that we're looking at. When we have that list of risks agreed with a company, we can then look at what our data is telling us and map our risk indices to those risks. So if a client is particularly concerned about government change and stability, because they know they have a lot of elections coming up in the countries where they operate, we will suggest some of our indices around that. So civil unrest, government change, we will map that. And we can build a tool, which it might be on our website or it might be in a Power BI, where you can see the data changing on a quarterly basis. So I think you mentioned earlier about signals and tripwires. It's very much the same thing for measuring that risk as well. So a client might look at it and say, oh no, this has just flashed red on my dashboard. I need to do something about that now. So having that data is a way of instantly collecting that global risk and being able to check, what's happening across my portfolio. Okay, it's green over here, but it's going amber here, so I should really start paying more focus to that and looking into what I can do to mitigate that risk.
And it's a big part of that challenge, getting your customer, your audience to understand which indicators they should look at and focus on, and like you said, which are the more important ones for them, and avoid, in a way, the sort of potential for information overload, because there's a lot you could potentially be passing on to them.
Definitely.
And, yeah.
I think that's the challenge. It's a challenge for us as analysts. It's a challenge for our clients as well. You want to know about everything. You want to be able to know what's happening everywhere in the world all at once, but that's just not humanly possible. So what we try and do for our clients is we work with them to focus on what they're really concerned about. And we can advise and say, we think this indicator would be perfect for what you're trying to track. But at the end of the day, our clients know their business better than we do. They know all the ins and outs. They know what they've experienced before. They know what the issues are coming back up. So they will be able to say, okay, you've shown me all of this. I'm going to pick these 25 indices to focus on because I think those represent my most important risks that I should look at. And that also, I think you mentioned prioritization of risk. That helps them prioritize as well. Because if they can say, okay, so these risks are green for this country, but they're red for this country, I'm going to prioritize looking at this country. But that's where client-only data comes in as well. So, a client will know, how much financial revenue is tied up in a particular subsidiary or a particular area. And so they can focus by that as well. So political risk and the kind of data and insight we provide is only one component that goes into all this decision making. So I think we as analysts have to be very aware that, we live and breathe political risk. It's what we do every single day, but it's only one part of a decision-making process.
Yeah. And you talk there about living and breathing this. You've obviously been doing this for a while. You've got a huge level of expertise in this area. What got you into doing political risk analysis in the first place? Where did you start out and what drew you into it?
Oh, okay. Well, yes, going back a few years now, but I didn't have the traditional route into political risk. I actually did English literature at university, which I loved. But then I graduated and I'd spent 3 fantastic years, reading books, doing analysis. But then, as is traditional for an English student graduating, you think, what can I actually do with that? How does that translate into the working world? And I thought, well, I'm good at analysis. I'm good at kind of taking in information and then summarising it. So I'm going to do a journalism course and then I'm going to see what comes up. And my journalism course, which was fantastic, they encouraged us to apply for jobs straight away. I got 2 interviews out of that journalism course. One of them was with a political risk company called Business Monitor International, which is still going today. And the other one is with a publication called Cage and Avery Birds. So I think you probably know, because I'm sitting here today, which interview I went to and which job I got. But in some ways you could say I kind of fell into political risk because I got my job at that company. I was put on the Latin America desk, right next to a Reuters terminal. And I immediately just started covering political risk because that was what was happening. I started working in 2002, we were still having the fallout from 9/11. There was a lot happening in that year. In some ways, I feel like politics goes in circles because I entered political risk at a time when President Lula was just coming into power in Brazil, and he is now president again. So it should all come around in a huge circle. But I guess a long way of saying that I didn't choose to go into political risk, but I came to love it because I started writing about it, and I just was fascinated by how it was a story. I always used to, because I studied English, I used to think there's a through line there from having looked at narrative and analysing narrative, and now it's political risk narrative. So what I find really interesting in politics is looking at what's changing, but then also what has stayed the same, talking about cycles and having looked at it for 20 years, what are we seeing come up again that has happened before, and what can we learn from that?
Yeah, and it's interesting you talk there about narrative and stories, because that's something I think me and my colleagues talk a lot about, is how does the data tell us a story? What story is it trying to point us towards or indicate, and how do we draw out the narrative points from what the data is showing us? So yeah, it's really interesting you say that as well. I wanted to also touch on, you mentioned earlier, having so much data that it's not humanly possible when somebody does want to understand everything everywhere all at once. AI. Is that starting to play more of a role, whether for yourselves on the analysis side, you and your team, or for customers even, to help them understand and pull and draw narratives out of your data perhaps that are relevant for them? Is that starting to creep in, or do you see it coming in the future?
I think we're in the early stages of looking at what it is and what it can do for us. So I think in terms of, I talked before about the quant and the qual inputs, and I think that AI can almost form a bridge between the two of them, because it can pull in both data, it can also pull in qualitative analysis, and it can produce an output. I think there's a lot that we still need to learn about AI, and what does it mean in terms of producing outputs. So it's how I see it being used in the kind of at early stages is effectively as a research assistant. All the work that we as analysts do trying to keep up with what happens in the world, gather together data from multiple sources, that can be done by AI. And then you have a human analyst come in to essentially edit it or cherry pick it and say, okay, these are the data points I want to pull. I think AI is going to become more sophisticated than that. I think it's already being used in that way. But I think definitely at an early stage, it comes in at that kind of early research stage.
Are you seeing it also affect the sources you're using? So like, as an analyst, you talked about starting your career sitting next to a Reuters terminal and seeing the news feeds coming through. With the AI enabling news feeds to be produced and duplicated and disseminated so widely so quickly, is that affecting the sources that the analysts you're working with are using and looking at? And are they having to dig a bit further beyond just what's in the news that might be presented to them, because it might be, well, if it's done badly and it's been produced by AI feeds, etc., it might just not tell them very much, or it might be that it just tells them something that's actually incorrect. Is that appearing at all on the radar for you guys? I
think it's something that we're not seeing in our workflows, but we are aware that it's a concern. Obviously, AI is trained on the data it has. So if you get some misinformation there, either by accident or on purpose, and that feeds in, that is a concern for analytic credibility. But I think what a lot of our analysts do is we have our news sources that we rely on and we know and we trust. So I think, and I'm speaking here as a layperson who is not in any way an expert on AI, but I think if you're using an AI model as a research assistant, you need to train it on the sources that you trust. You can't just say, go out and search from across the entire internet. You need to be looking at these sources or these sources. And of course that can change. A news outlet can change, a data source can change. But I think at least while you're training the AI tool, you need to be very careful about what you put into it at the beginning and keep a careful eye on what the outputs are. It'd be a really interesting comparison, theoretically, to see what an AI assistant could put together versus what an analyst would put together. What the time would be on that. I assume for an AI tool it would be quicker because they could do that in seconds, whereas we would take hours to do it. But how would the writing different and be different? And more importantly, can you get a tool to provide that so what? Can you pull together all the various qualitative and quantitative strands and put together a really tailored piece of analysis?
So it's about the quality more than anything. Yeah. And do you find that when you've got analysts who are focused on a particular region, they've got particular expertise, I mean, you've obviously built up a lot of expertise over time, they're going to be better able to spot the new stories or news that's not, or any information or data perhaps that's just slightly jarring for them, or doesn't make sense, or isn't something that actually they look at and think, I don't think I quite trust that. And I suppose the question there for me is, how important is that expertise and experience that you build up over time?
Again, I'm biased because I have that expertise, but yeah, I think it's really important because you look at things differently because you've dug into the details. You've seen multiple elections happen. You've seen things change around the world. I think it's particularly important in the sense of you need to go and look at what has not just happened in this country that you're looking at, but what is happening in other countries. And I think that's the importance of having analysts who sit together or talk together frequently and can compare and contrast and say, are you seeing this? Are you seeing it too? Is it a trend that we should be looking at? And then you can pick up on things. And I think on your particular point about seeing something that doesn't look right, I think as analysts we're trained to do that anyway. You try and read between the lines of what's happening, the narrative that's being presented. One example I think of is I remember, this was years ago now, I think it was even back when we worked together at Jane's, but I remember a piece of news came out and we were all set to write an article on it, and just someone said, you know what, I think I've seen that before. I think this has been misreported. And we sort of held off on it, and it turned out that the news outlet in question had republished something by accident that had been published 2 years previously. So it's that was caught, luckily, by an analyst who really knew their region and was saying, no, I've seen this. I know that this exact thing can't have happened again. So I always think of that in terms of, you've got to know your region so well. You've got to know your theme.
Yeah. We've talked about this being a big year in terms of political change, elections around the world. What are you looking ahead at in terms of 2025, prospects for 2025? I know you've, or Verisk Maplecroft has put out a report on trends, etc., and political outlook for next year. But maybe you can give us some thoughts on how you see current trends playing out and what you're looking out for in the next year or so that you think are the key areas of risk that we should be thinking about and trying to keep track of.
Definitely. We've just released our political risk outlook, and how we put that together was, we gathered together our data, we gathered together our analysts. We were really trying to think hard about what happens next. We've had the election super cycle. What are the trends related to that? But are there any other trends that will continue and not be affected by that? So particular issues we're looking at for next year is in terms of government stability in particular. We've had a raft of new governments come in. They're mostly still in their honeymoon period now. But what happens when that period comes to an end? When people start to think things aren't changing quickly enough or not in the way that I wanted, how will that discontent be expressed? And that ties into another key theme that we're looking at for next year, which is civil unrest, because civil unrest is not always tied to elections, interestingly enough, but I think that can provide a trigger for it. But I think if you're seeing this trend of governments have been in power for 6 months to a year, 18 months, things haven't changed, you've got that condition for civil unrest coming out onto the streets again, impacting businesses, impacting policy decisions. So I think keeping an eye on civil unrest for next year is going to be a major theme. I think trade is going to be a particular theme we're looking at next year, and that will be very closely aligned to ongoing trade and tariff discussions around various regions. So how will that play out for both countries, if new tariffs are imposed on particular countries, but also what does it mean for a business that is operating globally? I think that's the angle we're coming at it from. We're saying, if you operate in multiple countries and they all have different tariffs, different regimes, if you get into a situation where there might be tit-for-tat tariffs, what does that mean for you as a business and how can you kind of navigate those waters? So that's going to be one of those major themes. And then we put in our outlook for last year, I think we picked quite a few of these, but I think particularly conflict is going to be an issue. You mentioned earlier about kind of the sense that there's a lot of major conflicts going on in the world, but also kind of country-specific lower level conflict. And I definitely see that as an ongoing issue. We have no clear end in sight to the major conflicts currently going on in Ukraine and also in the Middle East, but we also have conflict going on within countries, and I think that goes hand in hand with that political discontent, the civil unrest. I think one of the key themes to look at, and one of the signals, if you will, is looking at how are people channeling that discontent. In a democracy, you aim to put that into voting. There are mechanisms to channel that discontent. A government can be changed, as has happened in multiple occasions this year. But what happens when people don't feel that they can express their discontent in that way? Then you start to see civil unrest, even conflict. It creates this kind of tension within a country where you have both the democratic channels, but you also have kind of the on the street channels of discontent as well.
Okay, so quite a lot to look out for next year.
I'm afraid so. I mean, it's never quiet. But I mean, we've talked a lot about risk actually, but I just wanted to say that I'm a risk analyst. You have a risk background as well. I think we talk a lot about risk, but it can be an opportunity as well. I think it's good to play the optimist sometimes and look at it from that perspective as well.
Yeah. That is a really important point, because you're right, we do tend to focus on a lot of the negatives, and that is the nature of the work that we do, is people ask us to look at those issues. I don't think anyone will ask us to look at the areas or the places that, as you might say, on your indices are all showing green. But what are the sort of silver linings, I suppose, that you might be able to pick out? Are there any causes for optimism, amid this environment we're in, where we're talking about increased civil unrest, conflicts ongoing, perhaps increasing? Is there anything we could be more hopeful about?
Definitely. I know it sounds like a lot of doom and gloom, but I think there are certainly opportunities, both for governments, but also for companies as well. If you are getting changes in nearshoring, you changing your supply chains, that is an opportunity for another country that perhaps hasn't been on the so much of a supplier to global companies to come in and become that location for companies to put their physical assets or their factories.
And when you talk about nearshoring there, sorry, you're talking about bringing jobs closer to, or bringing production closer to. So potentially
changing your supply chains. We've talk a lot about this and work. So maybe you are bringing your supply chains closer to home, or potentially you're moving them to countries where you feel more ideologically allied. So that creates risks, certainly, transition risks, and also risks for the countries that perhaps are having businesses move out of them. But also you can look at the opportunities as well. There's opportunities for companies to move into new countries. For those countries, that's a fantastic economic opportunity. And it has those kind of spillover effects of creating more jobs, generating wealth, more education, looking at it from a very optimistic view here. But you can say that there are opportunities to create conditions to counter the conditions that will lead to civil unrest. So you get the kind of you have that choice there where you could be going down the more positive route, and we shouldn't discount that because we tend to be looking at the risks as much as anything else.
That's great. I think that's probably a good note to end on. Something slightly optimistic in terms of what we've discussed up to now, but it's been a really fascinating insight into a field that I think people hear a lot about if they're not familiar with it and if they haven't worked in it. And it may have some air of not knowing quite how it works. I won't say mystery, but an air of not quite knowing how it works, because different organisations will approach it in different ways and do it in different ways. So it's been really useful to get that level of insight you've just given us in terms of how you go about doing it, how you go about understanding the world, breaking it down into different factors and then bringing it all together in terms of the analysis you produce. So thanks for coming on, Anna, and talking about all of this. Where can people go to find out more about some of the work you're putting out? Is it all on the Verisk Maplecroft website?
If you go to the Verisk Maplecroft website, this is an unashamed plug. Please go and have a look at our political risk outlook. You can download it from the website. That gives you a view of what we are thinking will happen next year. And we'll also be doing a webinar on the 15th of January, so where we'll be talking through our outlook for next year. So please come along, ask us plenty of questions. You and I have had a fascinating chat. We could keep doing this all day.
We could, yeah.
It's very much something I love to talk about. So thank you.
No, thanks. No, we could definitely talk about it all day and go off in lots of different directions because there's so much depth to this topic. So yeah, thanks for coming in and making sense of it, because it can be very, very complex and difficult to understand. So yeah, you've done a great job to help us get on top of it and think about how all of these things come together and play a role in helping us understand what's going on around us. So yeah, thanks, Anna.
Oh, thank you very much.
It's all too easy to be overwhelmed by data. There's a huge amount going on in the world, and just in that conversation with Anna, we covered so many topics that are connected and somehow driving different types of risks that we might want to think about, plan for, think about mitigating for, as we think about what we're going to do in the future, whether as organisations or as individuals, whether that's in business or in government. I was really fascinated by the combination of quantitative analysis and qualitative analysis that Anna described, and how that comes together to provide expertise to individuals and organisations, but how it also helps make something that could be very difficult to understand much more understandable for decision makers, showing them what to focus on and what are the really important things they should be thinking about as they set tripwires or signals, as we talked about, and think about what will conflicts, civil unrest, all of these things that we look at, how will they affect them so they can start planning for those risks in the future.
Sensing the Signal is brought to you by Atreides, the behavioural analytics company. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can find out more about what we do at atreides.io.